plague, cholera, HIV, coronavirus. Just when you thought it was safe to go back in the classroom, there is another virus spreading through our schools. And it goes by the name of DIKR, the DIKR virus. What does it mean? It means direct instruction in a knowledge-rich curriculum. This word, DIKR, was invented by one of its critics, Guy Claxton, on the right, a small voice, because on the left is the huge outpouring of ideology in favour of DIKR. Books, whole careers are made on the back of this virus that's spreading through our schools. The question for me today is whether it justifies its place on the pedestal of pedagogy. Should it be the one way, or really is it just one part of our toolkit? Well, what we see often in schools, I've certainly seen this from my son coming home, is the rise of the knowledge organizer, right? It's not just a revision sheet anymore. It's the curriculum, apparently, in some schools almost. If you know this, you'll do fine. Well, I don't really think my son could understand, Year 7, that first section on respiration. But anyway, he can memorize it. Surely that's good enough. Or, if you're in primary school and you're in the States, you might be getting something like this.
The first word is toward. Everybody, what word? Toward. Spell toward. T-O-W-A-R-D. What word? Toward. The next word is paw. What word? Paw. Spell paw. P-A-W. What word? Paw. Good. Going back to the beginning of that row, you're just going to say the word. First word, what word? Toward. Next word, what word? Paw. Next word, what word? Rabbit. Part 3.
I think you get the idea. I thought it might be quite useful if I helped you recognize some of the symptoms in case you're infected. Scripted lesson plans, as you've seen. Knowledge organizers are the curriculum. Always focusing on some skills that you can be really explicit about and transfer to someone else's mind. And, of course, little time for things that, are marginal in this philosophy. Discussion or experiments, other student-led tasks. But seriously, of course, there's nothing wrong with direct instruction. This is a Stone Age, Neolithic human who is doing a good job napping his axe. Now, it would have been a big mistake if he'd learned that by discovery or minimally guided instruction, as it's called in the literature, because it's bloody dangerous. Right? And you'd get injured, if not fatally, by one of the flakes that chipped off. So you don't leave that to chance. You definitely have a master napper who is training you by direct instruction. And it's actually pretty clear to evolutionary scientists that humans have evolved to learn by being taught. We are adapted culturally to doing that. And DIKR works. We use it a lot. We use it with young children. And you saw that in the classroom, didn't you? We use it with our dog. Yeah, well, not very well, though. But he can at least sit, usually. And so when we're trying to do something which I would never dream of doing, like drill a hole into my wall. But if I did, the first place I'd go would be to YouTube to get the direct instruction from there. So it works. But think about why it works and when it works. Our ambitions for science education go a little bit beyond the kind of thing you see there. This is a list of the top 10 skills for the 2025 from the World Economic Forum. And although obviously we expect some knowledge, we expect a lot more than that, don't we? For students going out into the world, a competitive, AI, robot-driven fourth industrial revolution world, they need to do a lot. High cognitive skills. So the question is, can this DIKR achieve all of that if we spend most of our time focused on that way of teaching? Well, I'll leave it to Albert. He has a good quote for everything. This is what he said. Paraphrased a little bit, because he hadn't heard of a knowledge organizer, but I'm sure he would have said that if he had. There is a little bit of evidence coming through from people as a sort of backlash to this movement, which has gone way across the States. When scientists looked at two different ways of teaching young children, because this virus has spread not just in secondary schools, but primary schools, kindergartens. It seems even some people are teaching children even before they've come out of the womb this way. So a 4-year-old child learning about how toys work, right? So there were two groups. The scientists in one group showed students how to make music. They did 3 actions and the toy would produce a sound or it wouldn't. And there were 9 combinations they showed the students. And what varied between the groups was, in one group the teacher acted like a knowing teacher, So I have this toy and I'm going to show you how it works, okay? And then in the other group, the teacher pretended to be like a curious student. Oh, wow, that's a surprise. Didn't think that would happen. I wonder what happens if we do this. How primary teachers can be. So in the two groups, what happened? Well, the group who were taught explicitly were very good at imitating what the teacher had showed them. They produced a lot of these 3 sequences that produced the sound and imitated them. But they generally didn't discover that you only need 2 of them. The last 2 actions were all that produced the music. And the children who were told, oh, that's interesting, and the teacher was just curious and modeling curiosity rather than telling the facts, those children discovered more. And there were other experiments on a similar vein which led these scientists to the conclusion that it can, if you do too much telling, that children are very good at recognizing what a teacher is. And when a teacher teaches you, what you do is you try and imitate the teacher. Because if there was something else that was valuable, she would have shown you, wouldn't she? Right? But she didn't show you, so obviously what she showed you is all there is. You wouldn't need to explore more, would you? See what I mean? So, in a sense, you're modeling the way to learn when you teach. But this virus hasn't just gone between classrooms, it's gone all the way up to government, right? A few years ago, our eminent minister, Nick Gibb, who came from a grammar school, of course, said, no way do we need to worry about child-centered instruction because it goes against the way the human mind works, right? And the human mind is designed to absorb lots and lots of teacher-driven facts. And if you're not shown what to do, you won't learn. That's basically what he was saying. And he went on to say, a waste of time trying to get children to act like scientists. Only experts can be scientists. Children don't have any business pretending to be scientists. So rigor and an enriched knowledge curriculum are the way forward. Well, where do they get their evidence from for this, I wonder? If you look at the papers, the one that's quoted more than any other, so I'm going to pick on it, is this one from 2004. Okay? And what they did was they were trying to teach the most clearly structured skill in scientific inquiry, which is recognizing variables and what effect they have on the outcome. Yeah? And there were 2 ways that they did this, Group A and Group B. And what they did to make sure there was no kind of confusion about which method they were using, they made them extreme. So they had an extreme direct instruction case. So they told the students everything. And they had an extreme discovery learning where they told the students nothing. Students just did it on their own, no feedback, right? Really lifelike situations. And of course, what they found was that more students learned the effect of variables when they were told something. What a surprise. Than discovering it from their own. Now, they're psychologists. I mean, it's bloody obvious, isn't it, that that's going to happen. And they went further and said, well, when it came to making more applied judgments, they did equally well. Hence this idea of equivalence of learning past posh title for it doesn't make any difference whether you use discovery or not. Well, you can see what a kind of biased experiment that is. You know the answer, and you design the experiment to prove it. Well, it didn't go unnoticed, because other psychologists who, come from the other school, critiqued that and said, well, that is kind of obvious. If you get no instructional feedback, you're not going to learn very much in a short time. It was all about efficiency. And there was only one session and an immediate test. Is that very much what happens in schools? Would you teach a skill like variables once and expect it to last forever? No. So they repeated the experiment, and this time they did after 10 weeks the test, and it turned out that even if you had no instruction and just practice over these 10 weeks, I think, of practice, you did just as well as 10 weeks of instruction. So it made no difference which way you did it to whether you could figure out this rule by yourself. So they argued that there was no need to have the instruction because it didn't have any extra benefit than the practice. So you can argue both ways. Well, clearly you do need some instruction, clearly you do need some practice. But the argument that people like Nick Gibb and these very famous psychologists, John Sweller, Paul Kirchner, and I think it's Richard Clark, Richard Mayer, all these people who backed these clever titles about, 3 strikes and you're out inquiry, all these sort of things, they are basically arguing from the point of view of a theory that you probably know now called cognitive load theory. Everyone knows this now, right? It's supposed to be held up by people like Dylan William, the assessment expert, as being the most important theory for a teacher to know. But it doesn't really tell you very much that you didn't know already. We know that if you make things too hard, then they go over students' heads, and you have to focus on the details that they really need to understand and give them enough opportunity to process them. We know that. But they argue from that theory that it tells you that you can't learn anything on your own, right? There's no point. It's too much cognitive load. You have to have a teacher explaining it to you. Well, the trouble is, how do they explain this, right? Children do rather well at figuring things out for themselves, and there's loads of evidence that they can do this when they're sufficiently motivated by the goal, where they have lots of support, where the game's well designed. So it's definitely not impossible to learn things on your own. And the most sensible chap, Daniel Willingham, recognises it. It's a much more complicated picture than either of these sides would like to believe. You get evidence for direct instruction, and you get evidence for inquiry. I've shown you the direct instruction, so I'll show you very briefly the inquiry. Most of the meta-analyses that have compared teacher-guided inquiry, because obviously that's what you'd do. You wouldn't drop the students in there. You'd give them lots of support, lots of prior knowledge before they go inquiring. And when you do that, it turns out that it is better, most researchers find, than traditional direct instruction. Lots of meta-analyses, but they all say very carefully they're teacher-guided, and they've gone a bit further than that now. So, for instance, what matters about the guidance is important, and what kind of task you give the students to work on. This is all a bit gobbledygook, but basically what they mean is if the students focus on not so much the hands-on skills side of inquiry, but building a model, developing an explanation, a mental schema in your head, if that's what you focus them on doing while they're inquiring, or inventing or experimenting, whatever they're doing, that's what makes the difference. Obviously, that's what you want them to end up with, isn't it? The schema. Right? So if they spend a lot of time focusing on building the schema with your help, then they'll do well. Whereas if they spend a lot of time just listening to you and not building a schema, they won't. I did psychology at university, and it was just the science of the bleeding obvious most of the time. But sometimes they go a bit further than that. So this paper is not very well known. I'd be really impressed if any of you know it. But it's a really interesting idea called time for telling. 20 years ago, two eminent psychologists realized that it was pointless just saying this or that. You had to say, when do I do this? When do I do that? So they developed this idea called, there was a time for telling and teaching and direct instructions, there's a time for not doing that. And they came up with a set of strategies, which we've adopted in our own course, which they call inventing with contrasting cases. And they've got some good evidence to show that if you just tell the students things before they're ready, then they don't learn so well, or they don't apply what they learn so well. That's what they mean by time for telling. If you do it too early, you come in with your theory too early, they don't understand it so well. So what do you do instead? Well, I'm going to show you in a concrete way, but this is just to prove to you this is real research. So they're using density. They're going to get the students to invent a rule by looking at different cases, right? And then hear an explanation. And they showed that these students could understand the concept of density better with that approach. So let's just remind you, in case you're not familiar with the science here, density is a ratio. It's hard because it's a derived quantity. You can't measure it directly. It's one thing over another thing. It involves proportional mathematical reasoning. And there's some prior misconceptions that interfere with it because, to separate density from one's idea of weight can be difficult at that age. But what often happens is some teachers, perhaps not physics teachers, would launch in and go straight for the idea that density is a ratio of mass over volume and go quantitative. What they suggested was no, do it in a different way. And this is the way we've interpreted their research in our materials. We want the students to invent a rule which gives them an intuitive sense of crowdedness. So we set up a scenario. This is the same one they used in the research. We've just embellished it a bit. So imagine that, I know clowns are a bit, no-go anymore, but just pretend. Companies send clowns to parties and buses. And the clowns are unhappy because the buses are too crowded. You could substitute clowns for something less scary. Your job is to calculate the crowdedness of each company's bus. That's what the students are going to do. But they're not going to do it on their own. What they're going to do is use perceptual learning, which works. We all look at things and go, that's a dog, or, I can see what's going on here, because we're designed to learn that way. So if you look at A and B, it's pretty obvious that A has two compartments and B is one, so B is more crowded. And you have a series of cases like that. And then you're asked, what is the rule, right? And then the kids by that stage would be able to say, well, it's some sort of ratio between, or they won't say it like that, between the number of things and the space they have to share. And you get a sense of crowdedness based on just perception and what you can see and think about without help. And by doing that, they showed that the students were able to transfer understanding on unfamiliar density problems better than if they'd just been told about it. Because, well, their explanation is they had, if you like, they prepared the way for a theoretical explanation by having some concrete experience and thinking. But they said it better when they talked about science as like a detective story. This is why I thought I'd share this with you. So it's a bit like being a detective, like Poirot, and you have to solve a puzzle, right? You have a phenomenon, and the solution is the theory, which in direct instruction you would explain to the students. Now, imagine, like me, you slept through most of that movie, and you woke up just at the end when Poirot comes into the carriage and has to deliver his, denouement. Who did it and how, right? Imagine that you were trying to follow that. It's very, very hard to follow his logic, right? If you don't know all the clues and evidence and situations that led up to that. It's the same thing then if you're a student trying to make sense of a difficult theoretical explanation in physics. You're trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together and they don't fit because you didn't really get the right shapes when you were kind of listening. If you'd spent more time making these puzzle pieces yourself, in other words, investigating the phenomena a bit, getting a feel for what it means, then you're ready to put it all together. And that's what the teacher's job is, of course. That's not saying there's no direct instruction. It's saying that there's a role for indirect instruction as well. Because the contrast is that the students are generating more themselves. We want them to think. We want them to want to think. But we don't know exactly what they're going to come up with. This is why it's scary, because we can't be sure that they'll get the right answer. And there isn't one way of doing it. There's so many. So you actually have to know all of those different ways in detail to decide which one works in that situation. So much harder. Although I've said it's a virus, I have some hope that this virus is waning and sense will prevail, that it isn't just about one way to do everything, that we need to think of it as a toolbox or toolkit, that a teacher needs lots of strategies and they need to know which one to use when. And anyone who tells you different, as Melanie here, she's a random teacher I picked off the internet, but she talks a lot of sense. And to oversimplify teaching when it's really very complex seems to be the mistake. To engage in binary thinking, right? You know, there are two types of people in the world. One likes to separate everything into two types and, well, you know what I mean. You know what I mean. So we don't do that, right? We can cope with more than two categories. We don't need to split everything as I'm right and you're wrong, or it has to be this or that. We have tools of different sizes and shapes for different functions, and this is our teaching repertoire. We need to know how to use it. This is happening in different countries around the world. Singapore has been moving in this direction for a long while. Australia's having this raging debate about whether they should carry on with DIKR or go back to slightly more broad teaching. But it could take a long time. So in the meantime, I'm just going to give you a few safety tips to protect you. That's what I would recommend. I hope that's been useful. How you interpret that in your teaching is taking many, many forms. The idea of mastery is simply that we want all students to rise up to a very high level of understanding and ability to do things with their understanding, and not leave people behind, not assume that just because they're low ability they can't get there. So let's see what you've all come up with and are doing. I hope this sharing will be really useful for you. Okay, thank you very much.